He headed to Big Sky, Montana to ski bum for a winter before enrolling in medical school. Or so he thought. Scott ended up spending the better part of 2 decades as a ski patroller, avalanche forecaster, and snow safety director at Big Sky Resort before joining the Sawtooth Avalanche Center staff in 2012. His past ISSW presentations include deep slab forecasting, post-control releases, professional near misses, shallow burials, worker safety, and mixed rain on snow avalanches. Scott is a National Avalanche School instructor and the president of Avalanche Worker Safety. He knows a little bit about a lot of different things and generally considers each day that he learns more than he forgets to be a success. So we're really thankful that he has come up, and he's going to talk about Frenchmen Creek. I had a lovely typo in the program. So Sheep Creek was last year. So on Frenchmen Creek, here's Scott Savage.
Got to put this where I can get at it pretty quickly. Well, thanks a lot for the kind introduction again, Olive. Can you guys hear me? I don't want to get yelled at by someone in the back there like the last speaker. And thanks for Christian, too, for saying, what was the term? So slightly older forecaster, something like that. It wasn't obsolete or dinosaur or barnacle. I like that. I appreciate it. Yeah, so I'm going to do the last talk. Thanks for everyone for sticking around. This will be fun. It's no big, ugly graphs. It'll be mostly a story, but I will be, again, requiring some audience participation. I may call on you if you're looking sleepy. I might throw candy at you to wake you up, see how it goes. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand or shout them out during the question or during the talk. I might say, that's awesome, I'm going to cover that later and keep rolling, or I might answer it then. Deal? Awesome. So, yeah, I'm down there in Southcentral, Idaho, another Southcentral, but we're in the Southcentral part of the state, and just to give you a size of our advisory area, it takes about 4 hours to go from the top near Stanley Banner Summit down through here, through Sun Valley, Ketchum, and then over to the western edge. So this isn't, there's a lot of text on these next few slides for my taste. I try to minimize the text on slides. I just want to paint a little bit of a general picture of what was going on. Don't sweat the little details. So the danger is rated high and considerable that day, depending on elevation. This is on February 16th, back in 2014. Primary avalanche problem, deep persistent slabs. Who knows what they are? Are they generally soft or hard? Come on. Hard. That's better. And they're going to tend to be, fairly thick. Most of the time you're talking measuring them in meters, not feet a lot of the times, the deep persistent slabs. So they're not little things. Do you think they're generally manageable or not really manageable for traveling around without explosives? Yeah, they're really scary. The way to deal with them is to avoid them, pretty much, right? All right. So secondary avalanche problem, wind slabs, and just a real, super brief snapshot. December and January faceted layers were stressed to their limit with 4 to 6 inches of water, so like 40, 50, 60 inches of snow in the last 10 days with some good winds. So the weather that night before, it snowed 6 to 10 inches of dense snow with some rain at the valley floors and moderate to strong, so good transporting winds. So, you're getting loading from both the snow and the wind. Temps near freezing. Then that day there's a clearing trend with winds shifting around, swirly a little bit, and temps in the 20s and teens. So clearing and cooling the day of the accident. So the bottom line in the advisory, our advisory product's really similar to the Chugach. They're based on the same platform, so that's kind of at the top. Avalanches will fail on both mid-storm weaknesses and deeper persistent layers, could be very large. Avoid wind-loaded slopes, steep consequential terrain, and large avalanche path runouts. So is everyone kind of getting the picture of what was going on that day? Spooky out there, right? Basically, we're at the tail end of a big, deep, persistent slab cycle that had been going on for several days, and it's maybe the first day that it's not actively loading during the day, but it takes a while for those things to settle down. It's not like, cool, it hasn't snowed for 2 hours, go get it. It's not one of those situations, right? So the story, it was a group of four folks who were generally in their late 50s and 60s, 2 locals, and 2 of their longtime friends who were in from out of town. They lived in, the 2 that were in from out of town actually spent a lot of time up in Alaska. They're basically badasses is the way to describe them. Both bush pilots. She was a Navy Corps medic. They worked doing remote electrical work where they would fly in the middle of nowhere, who knows where, doing industrial stuff in places where not that many people go in Alaska, and worked as independent contractors as electricians. So really self-sufficient, really good folks. They were there for about a week, and they tried to go riding the last 2 days, but the weather was just so bad. You either couldn't even get to the trailhead or you could barely get anywhere, so they weren't having much luck. And this day they decided, okay, we'll give it a shot. We know it's dangerous. We're not going to try to climb anything, but we'll just get out there, have some fun, go play in all the new snow, and see the sights. So they headed out that day. They talked a little bit about where to go, and they had talked about going to a couple different places. There are like 3 or 4 major trailheads that the riders use where we are. And they talked about going to a place called Baker Creek, which in general you don't have a lot of snow over your head you're not traveling in avalanche terrain, you're not in the run-out zones where you're traveling. They didn't go there because they hadn't been there before, and the most experienced person who had ridden around in that area a lot, Bob, he had ridden the most around Frenchmen Creek, so that's why they decided to go there, because he'd been there a bunch. So this is looking at where Frenchmen Creek is. This is Galena Summit, for those of you that have been around in that area in Idaho. So Sun Valley's down here and Ketchum, Stanley's up here. And they parked at the trailhead. It's about 4 kilometers, so 2.5 miles into where the accident occurred. It's just pretty much flat riding in the creek. You climb a little bit, but not much. But you can see you get into this zone right here, and you're impacted by paths on both sides of the road through this little bottleneck. So you're kind of in the gun sights from things on both sides. Either slope can potentially come down and reach you where you are down there. That day we as myself and another of the forecasters, Simon Troutman, and 2 researchers from Boise State, a guy named Scott Havens, who some of you know, and H.P. Marshall, we were riding in this drainage, the headwaters of the Salmon River. So we were literally just on the other side of the ridge when this thing happened. That's what the riding was like. If you got off the throttle at all or got onto it too hard at all, you're just right down through the trap door and digging a platform to start and do it again. It was really challenging for sure. You could go poke around, but it wasn't one of those days when you can go exploring all over the place. That's where we crossed the Salmon River, which is a creek at that point. But you're seeing just cool signs like this, real obvious signs of instability. It's just in your face. You see that where just a little 20-degree slope right above the creek is cracking and slumping into the creek on a layer of faceted snow. You can see the weak layer right there, the little dark line on top of a crust with that snow from the past 7 days or so. It is pretty dense. It was more Alaskan style slab, not light powder. Most of that is pencil and 1 finger, so pretty stiff. And there were signs of avalanches everywhere. Things that had broken, the night before, 2 days before, 3 days before. Not huge, but big enough to break trees and do a lot of damage. Definitely big enough to mess with people. So the riders, the group that had this accident, they definitely saw signs of recent avalanche activity just riding up to the trailhead. There's no way you could miss it. It was in your face. So this is looking at the path that eventually failed from right near the trailhead. They're riding up this way. And they had decided that they'd had enough of getting stuck. They tried playing around a little bit in some of the flats. This is taken a day or 2 after when I was doing the investigation. But they had decided, yeah, okay, we're done. We're tired. We're worked. We're going to just from digging sleds out all day. So they had decided to turn the sleds around. These are their tracks. There are 4 sleds that they turned them around, 4 snow machines. One of them managed to javelin auger into the creek there. That's the Frenchmen Creek itself. And they had gotten all 4 machines turned around, and they were in 2 groups of 2. There were 2 of them right around here, with one machine there and one machine over here off the debris, what would become the debris. And two of them were here with the two snow machines, and they were walking back to get on their sleds when one of them, the most likely way that this thing was triggered is that one of them released it just from walking. So a foot release or a boot release from walking around. It could have been a natural, but it wasn't actively loading at that point in time. So we'll never know what happened for sure, but in all likelihood it was a boot release, which is interesting that riding around on the machines didn't trigger it. So 4 people digging out snowmobiles and riding around, but then walking around did. And there were a few different avalanches during this cycle that were foot released like that. So it's something that we don't see very often, but it seemed like people would have better luck triggering them by wallowing around where you're actually in the facets than they would by riding around on machines. Go figure, one of those things. I don't have an answer why. So that's where the 2 groups of 2 were. They were both buried. We'll back up. So all 4 were buried. All 4 people in the group were fully buried by the slide when it came down. The first guy that was able to extricate himself, he was one of the folks that used to live in Alaska. He started by being able to move one finger that was pinched in front of his chest, and eventually after 45 minutes he was able to get himself out. So what's one of the things that you always hear about avalanches? You can't dig yourself out, right? Except when you can, which is a really rare event, but it can happen. So he gets himself out, in 45 minutes by himself. He gets out, he hears someone that he thought was yelling like over in the trees. And he starts walking that way, takes 2 steps, and it ended up being his wife, who is 5 feet away, buried underneath the machine right there. He digs her out. So now it's about 50 or 60 minutes. So you have one person who is fully buried for, his head was probably out a little before that 45, but a 45-minute burial. Then you have a 50 to 60-minute burial. Both survivors. So now they're both up on the surface. They have their beacons. They're probably hypothermic. They can barely use their hands. They said it took them, they're guessing, a few minutes to turn one of the beacons on to receive, because their fingers didn't work at all. And he didn't have a shovel to dig, so he dug her out with his bare hands. They finally do get a beacon turned on, a single antenna, older Arva, so they didn't have newer beacons. Immediately start getting 2 signals, a double burial. They recognize that, go towards it. At that point they decide, they were able to see the top of a helmet. So one of the people who ended up being the deceased, and there's a little bit of his helmet showing. They cleared the rest of the snow out from in front of his face, but she made the decision, she was a Corps medic, that he was dead. At that point, they still have this kind of close proximity double beacon search that they can't figure out what's going on. So they knew it was going to be difficult. They don't have a probe. Most of the rescue equipment was on the machines, so they weren't able to, have equipment. I don't know if they could have used it even if they did, because they did have a shovel at that point. They were able to get one off of the one machine that wasn't buried, but they couldn't hang on to it to use it to dig because their hands were so numb. So they're in a really challenging situation. What do? One of your friends is gone. You have some equipment. You don't have everything you need, and you recognize that you're in over your head. So they made a really difficult, challenging decision to go for help. There's no cell service where this is. So they ride out on the one machine that's running. Bob drops Sue off at the trailhead. So they ride out from here to the road right there. There's a lodge right up there. So fortunately, and this road's not that heavily traveled, but she estimated about a minute of getting dropped off there at the road, and then Bob went back in to continue searching. So a motorist passes by who goes and stops at the Smiley Creek Lodge, and she waited there to be able to hopefully meet help when it would come. The motorist goes down, is talking to the general manager who's at the lodge. It's a snowmobile shop and restaurant place that's pretty popular for snow machiners, and has a big parking lot right next to it too. So 2 local backcountry skier snowmobile folks that we know, one of whom's his wife is on our friends board, who happened to have just taken a level 1 with the full day companion rescue course, overhear the conversation. They run out, unload their sleds, pin it from there, go straight to the scene, and they get there, and it's just dead quiet. There's nothing going on. They're like, God, we missed it. We missed the rescue. And then they realize, it dawns on them, wait a minute, we are the rescue. So they immediately get a beacon out, do a beacon search. They get a hit. It was interesting, where he didn't even notice effectively it was a corpse at that point, about 5 feet away from where he had the signal, the guy that made this find. So he didn't even see that. He starts digging with his hands and bumps a helmet, and how he describes it, so the dead person talks to me. So the person, the victim, who ended up surviving a 105-minute burial, made like a moaning noise, and he said he just started screaming because he's thinking, okay, this dead person's talking to me. And they dig her out and get her out to the back to the trailhead. So here you have the woman who was buried for 50 to 60 minutes, the passerby, the motorist, who was nice enough to stop, go to the lodge, come back. She's waiting there with the car running. And then the 2 people who went in there and found this person who ended up surviving a 105-minute burial. 70-year-old woman who also had a heart attack while she was buried. They found out later, the doctors did, that at some point she had she had signs of having a myocardial infarction. Pretty amazing story. So while this was going on, we had arrived at the trailhead. So I was the one who took this picture. The fire chief who was running the search and rescue had arrived too, and he wanted us to wait there until it was a little kind of foggy while we were waiting there, as long as we did, but he wanted to wait until he had more information before sending us in, because he didn't really know what was going on. And we watched this whole thing happen. It was just mind-blowing seeing this person, slumped on the front of a snowmobile get driven out 2 hours after she got buried. Absolutely unbelievable. Blew me away. So some take-home points from this and things that I learned, and hopefully I'll be able to share a few highlights here. Some after having had a bunch of time to think about this. You don't see these things very often. 1, 4 people buried, and they dig themselves out, and 3 people are buried for that long and survive. It's just amazing. So did they really get that lucky, or is there something else going on? And this was originally an ISSW talk from 4 years ago that I did with a couple people, Dale Atkins and Terry O'Connor, who's a local physician at the hospital there in Ketchum. So this is kind of taken from that. I probably should put them on the front, but they definitely did some of this work, and I know some of the slides will cite them. So some of these take-home points are from work that they've done, and some of them are just from more mulling things over on my end. So I think one easy way to look at it, if we is everyone familiar with the avalanche triangle? It's kind of an easy way to group things. If you're worried about avalanches, you have terrain, snowpack, weather, and then decision making. So what we decide to do with all that information. I don't like the term human factors, it's decision making. Because that's what we're doing, right? We're making decisions. Personal beef. So terrain, we'll look at that first. Got to get my chocolate too. I'll try to not throw it at you too hard, but if you get the right answer, you get some chocolate. Everyone needs a little chocolate in their life. So what do you think? Do trees make it safe? No. We need some chocolate. I couldn't tell who said it first, so I just started throwing it. So that slide, the area in red over here is the tongue or wave of debris that they were buried in. The slide continued for about 1,500 feet that way, so there are just several tongues all through it. The debris, instead of piling up in a terrain trap, this is one thing that they were really fortunate. It really fanned out. So most of it was, I think it averaged about 4 to 6 feet deep, the debris pile did. It was up to 10 feet in spots, but a lot of it was pretty shallow, and that probably saved their lives. If that had piled up really deeply, then they wouldn't all been buried as shallow as they were. And we'll get on that a little bit later, but they were all buried pretty shallow, which was a really big factor in making sure that they could survive. So the snowpack. What kinds of avalanches were going on that day? Yeah, deep persistent slabs. And what's one of the weird things about deep persistent slabs that you can do that, were they triggered that? What's that called? Remote triggering. So that right there is my personal biggest red flag that I have, like from when I was operationally forecasting. As soon as you know that you can remotely trigger something, and remotely triggering it, who's remotely triggered a slide before? All right, over half, which is scary. But it's amazing until the first time you see it that you're able to be riding your machine or skiing or standing somewhere else, like way below or way off to the side, and you initiate this collapse in the snowpack, which then just ripples out over space and causes an avalanche somewhere else where you're not standing. The first time that it happens to you, you're blown away by it, for those of you that haven't remotely triggered something. And it's just really dangerous. Things can behave really unpredictably. So whenever you see that around, that's one of my biggest heebie-jeebies is if you start hearing from people that they're remotely triggering things, or you do it yourself, all bets are off. That's when people who really know what they're doing get caught and or killed. So really spooky. And in this case, they were kind of right over in that area, on completely flat ground, so they're on a 0-degree slope. And they didn't recognize that you could trigger an avalanche on a 0-degree slope while you're standing in the creek, basically, which a lot of people don't. It's not intuitive. You think that, okay, I'm not going to go climb hills, so I'll be safe. Just going to play it safe today, go ride mellow terrain. But if you're below steep terrain, and this is all, over 45 degrees at the top of these starting zones, then in the wrong conditions, you can get caught. So the weather. Recent snowfall and wind, yeah, tons of it over. It wasn't snowing at the time, but they did recognize that, yeah, it's dangerous. It's going to take more than a few hours for something like that to heal up. So on the decision-making side of things, this is where it gets a little more interesting. I'll spend a little more time. When they decided where to ride, what did you think about that? What do you guys think about this? Do you go to McDonald's because their burgers are just so frickin' awesome? These things suck. Tastes like a tire. No, you go there because our brains are wired to make us think that because we're familiar with it, because we're used to it, because we recognize it, thus it's good or it's better. Something called the familiarity heuristic. And it creates a trap where they went to that area because they'd been there before. They equated, I've been there, thus it's safer. And there are really only two drainages around there where you're really threatened by big slide paths over your head. There are a lot of other places where they would have been fine, where if all you want to do is just go boondocking and play in the flats and, motor around in the meadows, where you'd be fine. But unfortunately, that the lure of going to somewhere, the, false idea that because it's somewhere that you've been before and you're familiar with, it's safer, definitely played a role in this. And that's something that catches experienced people and professionals a lot too. There are all kinds of times when I look back at things that I did at Big Sky where you're just actively mitigating the same paths all the time. And if I would have been somewhere else for the first time, I wouldn't even consider doing what I was doing. Yeah, Dave. Yeah. Big Wally.
Same route, the same way.
Yeah.
30 years. And
Yep.
He always stood on that 25-degree slope and threw the bomb downhill. And one day that 25-degree slope was too steep.
Yeah, fatality at Jackson Hole, Big Wally, where a guy that had been there forever and doing it the same way that he always had. And, obviously you become more lax and loose doing something because you've done it repeatedly and repeatedly. It doesn't cause, we tend to not give it the same respect as something that's new to us and in your face. So that definitely played a role there. So the burial and the rescue. This is and this comes from Dale Atkins' work. Most of you know who Dale is. He's one of the foremost experts in the U.S. on avalanche rescue. Really knowledgeable person. So historically, traditional rescues divvied up into, you have self-rescue, that's getting out of the avalanche on your own. Avalungs and airbags are some tools that we can use to help us out. And then at that point, if self-rescue doesn't work, it tends to either go to companion rescue or organized rescue. So companion, that's your partners, transceiver, probe, shovel, maybe airbag, and organized rescue, which a lot of you are involved with. But these are, historically, they've been very segmented linear flows. It's kind of an either or. What Dale's been pushing for a few years now, and it's happening whether the search and rescue community really truly embraces this, is a more holistic, integrated approach where you have individuals, so instead of calling it self, and then small teams instead of calling it companions, and then professional. And the idea is that, that you're going to operate a lot of the time somewhere in here, where you have the individual saving themselves. Small team may or may not be a professional, may or may not be a companion. They're all going to be working in conjunction. And it's already happening just with, as Christian hit on, with the modern communications. I mean, you can get the word out to a lot of people really quickly in the mountains in a lot of places now where you couldn't before. And they're already seeing this in, Bruce Tremper gave a talk a couple of years ago and about the use of social media with Avalanche Rescue. There have been a couple saves in the Alps, one in Japan, where people thought, okay, well, my partner just got buried. What do I do? Do I call 911? They're like, hell no, I'm tweeting it. So they tweet out, Avalanche, so-and-so is buried, get help. And that's probably the best move that person could have made, because one of the other friends is going to call 911. And we all know sometimes if you're calling 911 and you get stuck talking to the wrong dispatcher who doesn't know anything about avalanches, you're done for 10 minutes. They're just yelling at you, don't hang up the phone, I need more information. It's like, no, I got things to do. So let your friends do that, tell them what's going on. So it can be a really powerful tool. And I think a lot of the rescue folks probably spend a lot more time thinking about it than I do. I'm more of a hasty team member, not running any kind of an organized rescue operation at this point. But it's really causing some deep thought on rethinking, okay, how do we do this, and where do all these modern communication tools fit in and these different teams? It's really changing the equation in a good way. So survival curves, this is the only graph I'll show you. This is from Pascal Hagley, some work that he and some other folks did. Basically, you have the chances that you're going to survive an avalanche. I've been pointing this way all day. I'm going to switch these poor folks over here. So you have 0% chance of survival and 100. So this is survival increases as the burial time decreases. So if you're in the beginning of this, that 10 to 18 minutes, you have a really good chance of living up in here. And then the curve drops off pretty steeply, but then it flattens in this area. So that area down there is what they call the latent phase, where the chance of survival stays pretty constant. Really, once you get beyond about 30 minutes with some of the data, the other is 60. But out in there, if you're already alive after 30 or 60, there's a good chance you're still going to be alive in 2.5 hours, which is really important. I mean, that's still, that number, it's not 0% chance of survival. It's probably like 6, 7 in here, and 15 to 20 in there, which is very real. It's a 1 in 5, 1 in 6 chance of being alive. This one I need to update with Dale. This was last updated in 2014, but these are just some examples in the U.S. of fairly lengthy burial survivals. 5 hours, 8 hours, 23 hours of 2 people, 5, 6, 5, 4. So it does happen. You're not instantly dead, at that 30 minutes. The woman who survived for 105 minutes in this case, this is a really interesting quote from her. I scratched again, had a little snow come down. It was then that I felt a little cold air come in. So she obviously was buried shallow enough, and the debris had the right characteristics that there was some airflow. And I won't get into that, whether it's diffusion, effusion, advection. We can talk about that later. Anyone who wants to geek out on the science of characteristics of debris, as long as Ava wants to talk with me, because I know she's looked at it. But it could possibly be to your advantage to be buried shallow. And by shallow, I mean upper 1 foot for sure, maybe 2 feet. That those of you that have walked around in debris enough, sometimes you're in that real blocky hard slab debris where it's obvious that there are going to be air channels coming through that. Sometimes you see these secondary waves come down on top. So you might have a big ugly pile of debris, but then there's a layer of softer stuff that comes down on top. So in the right circumstances, you may have a better chance of surviving if you're buried shallow. And not just because it's faster to dig you out, but you might actually be able to breathe. So let's compare that. So we have about roughly, we'll call it, 6 to 18% chance of survival once you get beyond an hour. Is that right, from that survival curve? So this is some stats that Terry O'Connor put together. There was a study in 2011. They looked at over 400,000 witnessed cardiac arrests. So witnessed and had, treatment began effectively immediately. So CPR followed by defibrillation. What do you think the percentage of favorable outcomes, which means someone actually has a life afterwards, they don't just stay in the hospital, but they're actually, have a reasonable outcome? What do you think it is?
2%.
This guy gets some chocolate. 2%. It's worth a couple Butterfingers there. Do you need maybe a Snickers too? You can hand it out to whoever else you want. So yeah, 2%. Think of the resources that we have no qualms about devoting towards saving these people, flying them around, spending tons of money, tons of resources for someone that has a 2% chance of having a favorable outcome compared to someone that's been buried for 90 minutes. Say you're on the side of you're called in and you're looking for someone who's already been down for 90 minutes. You're pretty dejected. If you're on something 90 minutes, I know I am. I think I used to have a rescue dog, and I assumed it was body recovery. 90 minutes, you're not overly optimistic. You're still moving as fast as you can, but we've done such a good job of stressing just the paramount importance of quick extrication, where you need to get someone out in that first half hour, that we've probably had the unintended consequence of convincing people that all hope is lost. It may go hand in hand to a certain extent. So I think we do need to be a little careful about that. Yes, you got to stress it needs to happen fast, but there is a chance, and we're probably better off thinking like Fido, like the dog. We have to maintain that attitude. It's something that's really important because, whether it's 6% or 18%, the odds are still pretty good about finding someone who's been buried for that long. So I think those 2 points or that last point is really important. Don't lose hope. We'll finish off with a video from that some folks in Montana put together about the event, mainly from the perspective of the woman who survived.
My name is Leslie Martin, and on February 16th of 2014, I lost my husband in an avalanche. There was 4 of us buried, and he's the one that didn't make it out, unfortunately. But thankfully, 3 of us did survive. George and I had been married for almost 40 years. I couldn't have found a better guy. He was willing to do all sorts of stuff as far as adventures, and we had a very good time together. And unfortunately, it ended the way it did. But he was out doing something he loved to do too, and I don't know why I lived through it and he didn't, but that's the way the cards were dealt. So George and I always snowmobiled together. We were always pretty careful about where we went. We still like to explore, but we knew, given our age and the dangers out there, we tried to stay safe. Bob and Sue were good friends of ours. Sue actually bought her very first snowmobile from me, and I taught her to ride. We also rode motorbikes together in the summer. We were a pretty good foursome. Sue liked to play like I liked to play, and vice versa. And George and Bob were really good friends, and we had a really good time together. We got up the morning of February 16th to okay weather. It was windy, but it was certainly a lot nicer than it had been the last few days. The last few days had been really, really nasty. It had snowed quite heavy, and this was the first real good snow we'd had all winter. And it was also getting pretty wet. Started riding in and proceeded to find a few places to play, and actually found out a little bit later that one of the places we were playing was another avalanche path, which we were not aware of. We discovered real fast that there was probably 6 inches of powder on top of 2 feet of mush because it had rained on top of it the night before. So it was really, the conditions were terrible. I had the hill behind me, and George was sitting on the other side of me on his snowmobile, and I was standing there talking to him, and all of a sudden I heard what I remember sounding like a baseball hitting an aluminum bat. It just went ping and a crack, and I turned around and looked, and all I saw was a wall of white fluff coming at us. I screamed because nobody else had seen it. My instinct was to cover my helmet with my hands, and then I laid flat down in the snow. I felt the snow come over me, pinging on my helmet, and as soon as everything went still, I pushed out with my hands, because I remembered that's what you were supposed to do if you were buried, was try to make as much of an air pocket that you could. And I also tried to raise my head. When they say snow sets up like concrete after an avalanche, it does. I couldn't move anything. I knew that I only had so much air to use, so I tried to keep myself calm, and I did for a few minutes, and then I realized that my air was going away. It started to become more difficult to breathe. I was buried an hour and 45 minutes. I remember seeing a very vivid orange globe in front of me that was sparkling. And then I remember getting quite warm. And I really don't remember anything after that until I heard the snowmobiles ride up. Seconds later, I heard a shovel in the snow, and somebody conked my helmet. When they got there, they really didn't expect to find any survivors. They were on a recovery mission. And they hit me with the shovel, and I yelled out. I'm told that both of them just about fainted, because I didn't expect to find anybody alive. They dug me out from the waist up, or enough to be able to sit me up, and I saw Bob there, and I think he was with George, and I must have known at that point what happened to George. The one thing that this accident taught me was to be very aware of where we stopped, or where we were riding, or where we were playing, because I learned about avalanche paths, and that you didn't have to be hill climbing to get caught in one. And so hopefully I've been able to teach some other people to be aware of what they're doing. And also, if you are experienced in an avalanche and you have friends buried, don't give up on them. They've learned that people can live for quite a while in certain conditions underneath the snow.
Yeah, it's awesome that Leslie, she wants to speak to groups and to share this story as much as people can. She's just into doing whatever she can to make sure that something similar doesn't happen to someone else. And she sold all her stuff and decided she's going to quit riding, understandably after that. But last winter, she just moved to Bozeman and she bought another sled. So she's back out again. The last thing I'll end it with is that in this accident, it was amazing how fine a line it was. That was something that I said in the accident report or investigation, that the title of that video, if you want to look at it again, it's called The Fine Line. If you search that, you'll find it. But if they would have been 20 or 30 feet downhill, closer away from the slope, not closer, but away from the slope, so on the other side of the creek, then they would have got this huge show from a powder cloud, been like, that was the coolest thing I've ever seen in my life, and gone home and had martinis since they already had dug all their sleds out. And if they would have been 20 or 30 feet back up the other way, where the debris was probably 2 feet deeper, then we probably wouldn't have known about it until someone randomly rode up there and there would have been 4 dead people. You know, it would have been one of the worst snowmobile accidents in the U.S. ever. It was that close, you know, literally 20 feet either way. With that, that's kind of all I have on that. If anyone has any questions, I'm, you know, happy to talk about it or answer.
What's the run out angle where they were?
The run out angle is 0, where they were. So the angle from the top, it was still 31 degrees. Yeah. So, you know, not unexpected at all. It was steep.
What are your
Yeah.
thoughts on why the track from the snow machines and remote trigger it, but just a simple step triggered it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, why did the snow machines not trigger it, but why did the boots trigger it? A lot of the snow machine tracks, if you're staying on top, they're not getting that deep. And if you read some of the more current literature, you know, that the force applied by the distance from the snowmobile track to the weak layer is, you know, not that much different from the force applied by a skier to the weak layer. So as long as the track isn't digging deep, then a snowmobile isn't necessarily going to trigger things like by an order of magnitude easier than a skier would. Where when you're walking around, you'd instantly be like, vunk, and you're standing in the facets, you're crotch deep when you're post holing, when you were walking around for the most part. So I think that's part of it, that there weren't that many places, if you looked, where the sled tracks really gouged down, where they punched down and got through that surface layer. But they did in spots. And I really don't have a good reason for it. I was actually talking to Mike Janes about that with, it sounds like kind of a similar avalanche cycle that he might have seen in Juneau, where they had, you know, more than one that was foot triggered like that, where just there must be some condition, and we'll get Dave thinking now he's retired, he has time to play with things like this starting in the fall or in the winter, that maybe there's something going on where you have certain conditions, I don't know what they are, but certain slab properties, weak layer properties, bed surface, the whole system working together, that for whatever reason, it's easier to trigger it by physically disturbing the weak layer itself than it is by just having the weight, adding additional weight and causing collapse. I think that's what's going on, that there is something, because we had 3 of them in this cycle where people triggered them with boots, and we didn't see a ton of snowmobile or ski triggered. Part of that was it was hard to move. There weren't that many people out, and the people that were out were evidently walking around. But yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, Dave.
I had an observation about the remote triggering on that particular path, because there's a lot of small trees uphill that tend to interrupt the fractures or the collapse propagation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's like not the ideal slope for remote triggering or upslope, in particular upslope propagation.
Yeah.
It's more conducive, it seems like, when you have a really uniform slab where you have a collapse in one layer, it's of course going to bend the adjacent slab, and that bending moment continues through the slab in a very continuous and homogeneous way.
Yep.
But when you have those trees in there, it's got a little more tendency to interrupt it. Not that, I mean, if you get big facets, all bets are off. So.
Yeah, and I think that was the key.
I
That
blame it on the all facets thing, but it wasn't the ideal slope for slope propagation.
No, it wasn't. Once you got, you know, the bottom part was, but once you got up in the starting zone with all those trees, you don't think, okay, I'd expect to see this break 1,500 feet wide. You don't. You know, you think that you might see pockets pulling out. Yeah. Yeah, back there.
Maybe just comment on sound. Talk to a number of people, at least, and have to ask you a little confused about the weighting of snow and the failure that occurs there, and where that can travel to versus sound.
So the sound, what she described, is like the ping. Is that what you're talking about, or what sound?
People are under the impression that the sound from your machines is actually triggering an
Oh, I gotcha. Yeah, so sound is just a pressure wave, and a very there's not a lot of energy in the pressure wave by me talking, no matter how loud I talk or stomp, like Deb earlier. There's just not, there's not a lot of energy. There's not a lot of amplitude in that wave. You're not triggering avalanches with sound. As far as, sonic booms flying 100 feet over the snowpack, from a jet going supersonic at 100 feet above your head, I wouldn't want to be standing on a slab that I was worried about if that happened. You're talking about, a way different thing. I mean, then you're approaching more the idea of an air blast with an explosive. But sound from machines does not cause avalanches. I can say that with all but certainty. I mean, I never say never, but all the literature says no, and all the models say no, that's not what's going on. Yeah, Wendy.
Thanks for mentioning that, Jed. We hear that a lot up here, and we've seen in the last few years, I think a number of these kind of foot penetration boot triggered avalanches and come down in the run out. So it's interesting to hear you talk about this. That's come up quite a bit, and lots of times in those scenarios, that's where the sort of, well, it must have been the can on my machine is so loud, so, it's been a
Gotcha.
conversation that we've had a lot here. That was a comment, but I had a question for you at the longer survival or the longer burials and having this actual chance of survival. If you've looked at or if someone has looked at having a helmet, having a snow machine helmet on versus a skier who doesn't have a full face helmet, if that plays into any of these longer survivals.
Yeah, it's a good question. So when he's asking about the presence or absence of helmet ski versus full face versus not with survival, and whether you're looking at European or Canadian or American data, they have such a hard time getting people to pick a location that's within a half a mile of where it actually happened, that getting them to say whether you had a helmet, whether the face shield was down or up or broken, which would effectively be the difference between like not wearing a helmet for what you're talking about, the ability to create airspace in front of your face. So right now the data isn't good enough to look at that right now. Ideally there'd be some data set in the future to look at it, 'cause it'd be really interesting to know if you have a better chance or not, wearing some sort of a full face that, you can't get snow in it.
Maybe that's our new rescue device, just a bubble.
Yeah, the Avalanche bubble. They need to design a new one piece that has an integrated helmet. Any other questions? Yeah, right here.
So the remote release, that's speculation on your part?
Yeah, remote triggering. So that avalanche, it could have been a naturally occurring avalanche. Usually the vast majority of naturally triggered avalanches happen, there is an impetus, so there's a loading event to trigger the avalanche. It's still natural because it's not a person triggering it. So it is conjecture, but I would personally put it at like over 99.9% that they triggered it. I can't say for sure, but it would blow me away and everything I know about avalanches if that happened naturally while they were walking around on it. But yeah, I can't say that as a fact. Correct. Yeah.
You mentioned that her avalanche are getting used to them older, and a lot of that factor as far as
Yeah, I think part of the factor what that caused was the close proximity double burial being about 5 or 6 feet away. It's really hard if you're not a trained professional, if you're not practicing all the time with an older single antenna beacon, to not be confused by those, competing signals effectively. It makes it a really challenging problem if you're not training specifically for it. So it was a factor. Yeah.
I got a question. What happened to Bob? He started back to the site with the 2 rescuers from the lodge. It sounded like they got there and there wasn't anybody there.
Yeah, it was interesting where Bob was there. They didn't see him because they had such tunnel vision that he was there on site. I think he might have been digging out a machine or trying to get a shovel or trying to get a probe. I don't recall off the top of my head.
Or at the other area.
Well, it was so close. They would have seen him there because they were only,
Yeah, I know.
the deceased was 5 feet away from the other person. I can reread the accident report and I'll probably have a better answer
But
for you.
They did eventually. But we didn't.
Yeah, so a lot of those scenes,
That was when they first got there. They didn't notice the other.
Exactly. But then as soon as they started doing anything when they were on scene, Bob was the one in the blue jacket. There were, 3 people there, basically. All right. Well, I'll be around, I think, having a barley pop or two if anyone else wants to talk about this or anything else. And I'll turn it back over to Olive.
So a couple last minute announcements. One, if you came in late and did not